Hi, class, and welcome to the second lecture of this first week. Today, right now, we're going to be talking about philosophical thinking. As we talked about in the first lecture, philosophical thinking is basically critical thinking. And to give you an idea of what a critical thinker would look like, a critical thinker would not automatically dismiss a position that is opposed to her own. In other words, she would seek out counterarguments and continually challenge her beliefs by taking on counterarguments. Also, a critical thinker would not take her own ideas for granted and would recognize the need for supporting them. So she wouldn't just assert something, she would assert something along with reasons why someone should accept it. A critical thinker would be open to the idea that her beliefs could change in light of a better counterargument. She would hope that her knowledge would grow when proven wrong and would be excited by that prospect. So she would embrace a counterargument that defeated her own because it would present an opportunity to become wiser, because she would no longer hold a false belief. And lastly, a critical thinker would not accept public information without question. She would not accept any argument that she heard without questioning it and evaluating it in terms of the evidence provided in support of it. So philosophers and critical thinkers essentially deal with arguments. As we discussed in the first lecture, an argument is not shouting and fighting. It is a conclusion that is supported with reasons. Just to get some terminology down, in logic, reasons are known as premises. They provide the evidence that supports the conclusion. The conclusion is the main point you are trying to convince others of. In any argument, you will have one conclusion, one main point you are trying to get your listener to accept. And you can have any number of premises. Oftentimes, the more premises you can provide, the more likely it is that your conclusion is true. So here's an example of an argument. This is going to be a set of claims that I'm going to provide. Because identical twins often have different IQ test scores, and identical twins inherit the same genes, then the environment must play some part in determining IQ. This is an argument. What I want to work with you right now on is distinguishing premises and the conclusion. There are actually indicator words that often show up that clue us into whether a claim is a premise or a conclusion. The word because is a premise indicator word. We use it when we are providing a reason you should accept a claim. So if someone says they are a talented athlete and someone else asks why, they're going to provide reasons or premises, saying things like, because I broke the school running record, and because I've been sponsored by an athletic company, and so on. So we use the word because to provide reasons. So when we see that word, we know that we're dealing with a premise. The second statement is also a premise. Identical twins inherit the same genes. These two reasons, number one and number two, provide the support for the conclusion. The word so in our third claim here is a conclusion indicator word. It means that we are giving the main point that someone is trying to express, we're trying to convince someone of. Now we're going to look at a second argument. Since it's wrong to kill a human being, and abortion takes the life of or kills a human being, it follows that abortion is wrong. Now, just to throw this out there, this isn't my personal view or something I'm trying to convince you of, but it's an argument worth considering and looking at. So we're going to look at what statements are premises and which is the conclusion. It's a moral argument, so essentially it's looking at what's right or wrong, and it's trying to convince someone of what's right and wrong, putting it in the moral realm. So in the third statement, we have the controversial claim that the arguer is trying to convince the listener of. It's the issue the arguer is trying to settle. And it follows that is a conclusion indicator phrase. To support that conclusion, we have the first sentence, which makes a less controversial claim that the arguer hopes the listener will already agree with, that it's wrong to kill a human being. And this is a moral claim about the ethics of killing. The word since is a premise indicator word, and we often use this word when we are providing support for our conclusions. The second claim makes a metaphysical assertion about the status of a fetus, that it is a, quote, human being. Implied in this premise is the idea that human beings have inherent rights that should never be violated. Together, these two premises support the conclusion. And sure enough, if someone accepts the first premise and accepts the second premise, that person would logically be led to also accept the conclusion. Because we've said it's wrong to kill a human being, and we've defined human being in a way that includes a fetus, so the conclusion follows logically from the premises. So there's a logic to this argument. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to accept the argument, but it does have a logical flow. So if you disagree with the conclusion, it's likely that you take issue with at least one of the premises, or you think the argument misses an important premise, leaves it out. That would change our thinking on the matter. Now we're going to talk about evaluating arguments. Our book goes over this pretty well, but one thing that we try to do as critical thinkers is find all the necessary and sufficient conditions needed to support a conclusion and persuade listeners. So let's look at the difference between a necessary and a sufficient condition. A necessary condition is a defining characteristic that must be met. It alone doesn't mean that we must accept the conclusion, but it must be there if the conclusion is going to be true. So we'll get into some examples that makes this more clear shortly. A sufficient condition contains all the necessary conditions to fully define a subject matter. So talking about this in a general way might be confusing, but let's get into some examples. So here's an argument. Animals experience pain just like humans. Humans can thrive on a vegetarian diet, meaning eating animals is unnecessary. We have a moral obligation to reduce suffering in the world whenever possible, and therefore we should not eat animals. This is another moral argument. It's focused on what's right and wrong. Now we have three premises or reasons that lead us to our conclusion, which is at the end. And as a note, I've simplified things by making the conclusion always the last statement, but in conversation, oftentimes the conclusion leads the argument or falls in the middle. For instance, oftentimes someone starts by saying, eating animals is wrong, and then provides all the reasons supporting the claim. So just note that the conclusion is not always the last thing you hear when you are listening to and evaluating an argument. So necessary conditions are things that have to be present in order to have an acceptable conclusion. So let's take number one. Animals experience pain just like humans. Well, this is something that has to be true if we are going to accept the conclusion. If animals didn't experience pain and pleasure, there would be no reason to feel moral qualms about eating them. Most people don't feel moral qualms about eating plants because they don't have nerve endings and they don't even resemble an animal that feels pain. So we don't feel moral conflict when we eat a plant. However, this moral conflict is present in eating animals because we know they are sentient beings. So this first premise has to be the case in order to accept the conclusion. However, it's not a sufficient condition because it alone doesn't mandate that we stop eating meat. Other conditions must be met to draw the conclusion. So we go to number two. Humans can thrive on a vegetarian diet, meaning that eating animals is unnecessary. Again, this is a necessary condition. It alone doesn't mean that we shouldn't eat animals. A lot of people do things that are unnecessary that we wouldn't call immoral. For instance, parasailing. It is not necessary that people parasail, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. So that makes it a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. A sufficient condition is one that gives us all the information we need to derive the conclusion, but that's not the case here with number 3. We have a moral obligation to, now we move to number 3. We have a moral obligation to reduce suffering in the world whenever possible. If this premise didn't exist, then we could accept that animals experience pain, and we can accept that we don't need to eat them, but we could still say that it's okay to eat them because we have no moral rule condemning it. So number 1, 2, and 3 are all necessary conditions needed to derive the conclusion that we should not eat animals. So basically, if you combine 1, 2, and 3, you have all the necessary conditions you need to derive the conclusion. So combined, they make up the sufficient conditions supporting the conclusion. In other words, if someone accepts premise 1, 2, and 3, you would have to accept the conclusion as well. All the necessary and sufficient conditions are met to derive the conclusion. Now, meeting all the necessary and sufficient conditions doesn't mean that a conclusion is true. It means that the argument has a logical flow. If we accept the premises, then we accept the conclusion. However, we can still question the premises. And if we find that at least one of the premises is false, then we would have no reason to trust that the conclusion is true. So for instance, number 2, humans can thrive on a vegetarian diet, meaning eating animals is unnecessary. Many people would challenge that premise and point out that a lot of people on vegetarian diets are anemic, meaning that they don't have enough iron in their system. They become sick and weak as a result. Now, undoubtedly, some people thrive on a vegetarian diet, but a critic of this argument might point out that not everyone can. And so if everyone were to stop eating animals, this would cause quite a bit of suffering in the world for humans. So it could call into question the conclusion. Also, number 3, we have a moral obligation to reduce suffering in the world. Well, this is a moral rule being asserted, and moral rules are controversial. Not everyone accepts that the ends can justify the means. For instance, sometimes we lie to people and it helps them feel better and it reduces suffering in the world. But someone challenging the premise might argue that lying is never okay, and just because it achieves positive results at times can't justify it. And so you might also question this moral rule and say that we are not morally obligated to reduce suffering in the world whenever possible. Sometimes we might have to act in ways that increase suffering in the world, but are justified based on moral principles. So we found ways of challenging premise 2 and premise 3, which call the conclusion into question. Now, modern scientists would have us believe premise 1, but there have been philosophers in the past that have challenged it as well, such as René Descartes, who argued that animals are like machines and don't experience pain because they lack a soul. So you could even question premise 1, although that's not a very plausible approach with what we know today. So the key is that if you have an argument where all necessary and sufficient conditions are met, you have a logical argument. That being said, it doesn't mean that you have to accept the conclusion. There is still room to evaluate the argument critically. We can still question the truth value of each premise. Okay, so we're talking about critical thinking and we're talking about logic, but what is logic? Our book has a nice definition. Quote, logic is the branch of philosophy devoted to determining what counts as solid, disciplined, reasoned thinking. So not only do philosophers study what the nature of reality is and what is right and wrong, what social injustice entails and so on, Philosophers also examine what makes for good argumentation, what necessary and sufficient conditions have to be met to know that we have a logical, consistent argument. And that's what logicians do. Logic is a tool. Philosophers use it to evaluate their opponent's arguments and look for possible weaknesses, or to understand what assumptions are being made in the premises in support of a conclusion. They also examine what their own arguments look like, and they look at their own arguments for possible inconsistencies or flaws. And logic in a way resembles mathematics. You have certain rules for addition, subtraction, division, and so on. Likewise, logicians identify a number of rules for proper sound argumentation. Aristotle is a famous Greek philosopher and a student of Plato, and he's considered to be the father of the field of logic. Basically, what he did was to develop a formalized system for reasoning. He identified a number of argument forms that are logically consistent or have logical inconsistencies. So I'll give you an example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. You see the word therefore, and this is a conclusion indicator word. So Socrates is mortal is the main point the arguer is trying to convince others of. And we have two premises. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. This is known as a syllogism. And basically, any argument that has this form is logically consistent. In other words, no one could accept as true these two premises while arguing that the conclusion is false. If these two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Interestingly, you can plug in any number of values into this argument form and maintain its logical consistency. So for instance, you could say, all dogs are mammals, a golden retriever is a dog, therefore a golden retriever is a mammal. Okay? It actually has the same form as the argument about Socrates. So we plugged in different words, but we kept the same form. So you can still count on the conclusion being true if the premises are considered true. So true premises equals a true conclusion. Aristotle discovered a whole bunch of these logical argument types and forms, so we can recognize them when we are arguing, and his contribution to the field of logic dominated philosophy for the next 2,000 years. So now we're going to study fallacies, and in particular, informal fallacies. But before we get into that, we'll just look at what a fallacy is in general. And it's an argument whose premises do not logically support a conclusion. And what that means is that you can have all true premises, but still end up with a false conclusion, because the premises don't lead to the conclusion. And a great way to show this is through an example. So here's an example. The first premise is, if someone lives in Seattle, then they live in Washington. The second premise is, I live in Washington. And the conclusion is, therefore, I live in Seattle. This is a logical fallacy. It's known as affirming the consequent. And I'll show you why it's a fallacy. Suppose I live in Vancouver, Washington. Well, then the first premise would be true, because if someone lives in Seattle, they do live in Washington. The second premise would also be true. Yes, I live in Washington. However, the conclusion is false. It is not the case that I live in Seattle. I live in Vancouver. So in other words, we cannot trust our conclusion on the basis of the premises provided. Anytime we see an argument with this form, affirming the consequent, we can say that it is fallacious, and we should not trust the conclusion on the basis of those premises. So recognizing fallacies allows us to throw out arguments that don't have logical consistency. So there are all sorts of structural fallacies like this, but it goes beyond the scope of this class. However, if you were to take a logic class, you would spend time studying all these different types of fallacies. And it's pretty interesting. And if you're someone who enjoys doing math problems, it involves that kind of mode of thinking. But what we're going to study in this class is informal fallacies, which refer to arguments that can seem persuasive, but again, their conclusions are not logically supported by the premises. Often they appeal to a listener's emotions, and that's why they seem persuasive. They make you happy, or they stroke your ego, or they ignite your anger, or they play on your fears. But meanwhile, they direct you away from the topic at hand. So let's look at some examples. The first one is hasty conclusion, incomplete evidence. And that's what our book calls it. But it also goes by the name of hasty generalization. Basically, when you take a small sample and then generate a huge, broad conclusion off of it, you are committing this fallacy. You can often find fallacies in political speeches, debates, and so on. So we're going to look at some examples of those. So one of the major setbacks in Hillary Clinton's campaign was when she claimed that half of Donald Trump's supporters are deplorables, meaning people who are racist, sexist, homophobic, or xenophobic. You can see how this kind of argument is appealing to Clinton supporters. It simplifies the opponent's base and their support. The problem is, it's not based on any statistics, studies, surveys, or reports that have been put out. Now, there definitely are people who are racist, sexist, homophobic, or xenophobic who support Donald Trump. For instance, David Duke is a politician who used to be a Ku Klux Klan member, and he's a supporter of Trump. There are people who fit this description, but to claim that half of Trump's supporters are deplorables is really to make a broad claim without evidence. And sure enough, she got called out for it and apologized for being, quote, grossly generalistic. But the term became a bit of a mark of pride for a lot of Trump supporters towards the end of his campaign and played a role in harming her candidacy. Let's look at the ad hominem attack, and this is Latin for against the person. As you might have guessed, it's a personal attack against someone. And Donald Trump just recently committed this fallacy when he tweeted, "Having a good relationship with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. Only stupid people or fools would think that it is bad." So here he personally attacks people who support sanctions and other measures against Russia for their interventions in the U.S. political process, as well as their role in the Chechnya war, their role in Syria, and so on. He doesn't address the issues, but simply denigrates the character of people troubled with Russia's world involvement so he's attacking people's character rather than the issues that are at hand here. Also, during the election campaign, he also continually referred to Hillary Clinton as Crooked Hillary, which again draws people's attention away from the actual issues, policies, and plans and attacks her character. The same fallacy was, of course, used against him and still is. Democrat Elizabeth Warren said this during the campaign: "Donald Trump makes death threats because he's a pathetic coward who can't handle the fact that he's losing to a girl." Again, this ignites our emotions and can seem persuasive, but it's actually an ad hominem fallacy. This was her response to when Trump insinuated that NRA supporters might be the only ones who can stop Hillary Clinton from taking away the Second Amendment rights if she were to become president, which many took as a call to violence. So instead of talking about the actual claim that Trump made and the dangers of making such claims, Warren diverted attention away from that and attacks his character. So her fallacy takes focus away from Trump's claims about threats to the Second Amendment if Clinton is elected and personally attacks Trump instead. The next one we're going to look at is questionable cause. This is where you see an effect and you attribute a cause to it without real justification. And we do this a lot in sports. You might find you were wearing a certain article of clothing when your team won. And so you think that it's necessary to wear that clothing every time they play, thinking it played some kind of role in their winning. So you're creating a causal connection that isn't real. Okay, so going back to politics, during the campaign, Donald Trump said Barack Obama was the co-founder of ISIS and Hillary Clinton invented ISIS with her stupid policies. So this is a questionable cause fallacy because it's noted that the terrorist group's roots predate Obama's presidency and Clinton's role as Secretary of State. The Middle East is also very complex. Obama and Clinton consider ISIS an enemy, and they've combat that group. They obviously didn't invent the group. And I'll include this link here. PolitiFact goes into great detail about the roots of ISIS and debunking this questionable cause fallacy. So you can go to the PDF version of this PowerPoint and click on it if you're interested. Next is begging the question. This is also known as circular reasoning. It occurs when you have a highly controversial premise and then use that premise to support your conclusion. It begs the question, why should I accept that this premise is true? It needs to be the conclusion of its own well-supported argument before you can start using it as support. It can also refer to a circular argument where the premise and the conclusion essentially say the same thing. So here's an example. Students like rock music because it is the most enjoyable music around. This is a begging the question fallacy. It's circular. They like it is equivalent in meaning to they find it enjoyable. So you are essentially saying the same thing in the premises as you are in the conclusion. And then appeal to an authority is what our book calls this next one, but I would like to interject appeal to an inadequate authority. I think that's more accurate. And that's because there are times when someone can justifiably appeal to an authority, when that authority has expertise in the field. For instance, I'm not a scientist, and I can't be expected to know the details of, say, global climate change. So I'm therefore justified in referring to a highly qualified, educated person in the field when talking about it. That person is a qualified authority. Where I commit the fallacy is when I refer to or cite an authority who doesn't have the credentials or has a conflict of interest. So someone who doesn't have the authority to speak on that subject. For instance, abortion to save the life of a mother is an irrelevant issue because a former Surgeon General, a well-known pediatric surgeon, claimed that in all his years of surgical practice, he had never seen a case in which such a dilemma had arisen. The authority being cited here is a pediatric surgeon, and a pediatric surgeon is not an authority on abortion issues. He is an authority on surgical procedures for children. So basing a conclusion on abortion on the testimony of a pediatric surgeon makes for a fallacious argument. The authority cited is not someone to be trusted on the issue, so we shouldn't trust that the conclusion is true. Okay, slippery slope. We come across this argument all the time, but you start with pretty reasonable premise, and then that leads to a more extreme case, which leads to a more extreme case, until very quickly and without justification, you end up with an very extreme and unlikely conclusion. So we often hear this argument on gun control. What seems like reasonable restrictions on guns with no legitimate civilian purpose, for instance assault rifles, will lead inevitably to total prohibition of gun ownership that ends in virtual slavery at the hands of a totalitarian regime. So here you start out with a reasonable starting point, a prohibition on assault rifles. But then you quickly and without evidence make a leap to thinking that all of our Second Amendment rights will be lost and all guns will be taken from all citizens and a totalitarian regime will emerge and we won't be able to defend ourselves against it because none of us have guns anymore. That kind of leap needs to be justified with reasons and evidence. And without that evidence present, the slippery slope fallacy occurs and you should not trust the conclusion. In other words, the downward slope is more precipitous than evidence warrants. Okay, an appeal to popularity. This is where we base a conclusion on how popular it is within a certain group. So for instance, an argument that could have been made during the Clinton campaign is this. According to a Gallup poll, Clinton enjoys overwhelming support among female voters. Therefore, she should be elected president. If Clinton's popularity with a certain group is the only reason someone is providing to say that she should be president, a fallacy is being committed. It again diverts our attention away from the real issues. For instance, what are her policies? How is she going to help the economy? How will she protect our interests overseas? What will she do about health care? And so on. Okay, and an appeal to pity. And I'll give you an example that I hope nobody will fire back at me during this quarter. Professor Pancras, I must get an A in your course. If you don't give me an A, I won't be able to go to law school. So here, you are taking attention away from your effort, from how well you understand the material. You're maybe missing not addressing a mistake or a misunderstanding that I had when I was grading one of your papers, which might provide a real reason to change your grade. Instead, you are relying solely on my feeling of pity in order to get an A. And that makes it an appeal to pity fallacy. So don't do it. So I just went through a number of fallacies, and our book goes over them as well, and framing them within a larger sample dialogue on gender equality. That's really well done. So it's important to study them because you can start to recognize them occurring all around you. And when you see that a fallacy is being committed, you can immediately throw it out and not be fooled by it. Okay, so that concludes this lecture. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to interacting with you in the discussion boards.